Okay, last lecture on income inequality. Topic that has become quite popular. And so we'll just talk about, let's do an intro, just thinking theoretically about inequality. Then we'll spend actually most of the lecture here looking at the data because although it's portrayed one way in, I think, in the popular press, within the profession, within economics, it's actually much more contentious how to measure these sorts of things. And so we'll spend we'll get in the weeds on the data. We'll look at the causes, and then finally we'll end with some policy prescriptions. Okay, and so if you have a market economy, all right, so you have a market economy that rewards innovation and invention. So people come up with new things, people make something better. Well, you are not going to have an equal income distribution in that case. There's going to be some people who are better at that than others. You think about basketball. There's going to be some people who are just better at basketball than others. There's nothing that's going to guarantee we're all equally good at basketball. As much as I wish that were true for myself. And so we're going to have differences in kind of skill endowment and educational attainment and access to those things. That's then going to yield a unequal distribution if you have a market economy. If you have some sort of system that just, assigns everybody a job, then you might have a more equal distribution. And then, of course, there's kind of differences in initial wealth that may matter. Now, so you are just mechanically if you organize in this economy in such a way to promote innovation, to promote invention, you are mechanically going to get this difference in outcomes. And I think it's useful to sort of think of the sources of inequality because I think, although I could be wrong, I think inequality that kind of comes from value creation, what we would call value creation, doesn't bother people that much. So people that are entrepreneurs, people that make something, if you're a famous stand-up comedian, I don't think people are bothered by that. Or, if you're a famous artist of some kind, people are like, okay, of course that person makes that much money. Or, I mean, people aren't bothered that much that LeBron James makes however much LeBron James makes. They see that as, okay, he's skilled, he works hard, like that's fine. Although maybe some people are bothered by it. And then, or like people who invent something new, hey, this person came up with this fantastic new invention. It's okay that they get a little more. Maybe they get too much more, but it's okay that they get a little bit more. And there's a difference between value creation, essentially adding to the pie. So, this is important to think about the economy as a zero-sum game or not a zero-sum game. So the economy is not a zero-sum game. It's a growing pie. We saw that in the very, very beginning of the course, where we talked about how actually, the amount of things that is produced and the capabilities is actually expanding over time. So it's not a zero-sum game. And so in that instance, if you're just adding to the pie, I don't think that source of inequality bothers people that much. However, if you're taking, say, an existing pie, taking more for yourself, that source of inequality does bother people. So this is, from political entrepreneurship, essentially using the government to, regulatory capture, using the government to, so I get an unfair advantage in the market. Or what this is also sometimes called crony capitalism, where it's like, hey, I know so and so, in the government, so I get this like extra leg up, or I have this inside information, or I get the government contract and you don't. Another way to just think about it is makers versus takers. So I kind of value creation versus value extraction, economic entrepreneurship, coming up with something new, innovating, versus political entrepreneurship, finding a way to get an unfair advantage, and then makers versus takers. Okay. And I think it's useful to think about when you think about inequality, which I'll talk about this in a second. People tend to think about inequality in terms of this gap. I think the focus is primarily on the rich. How much richer are the richest? At least in the popular discourse. And it's important to think, okay, where is that gap coming from? Is it coming from creation or extraction? And if you're thinking about policies to address inequality, you don't want to kill this one. You don't want to kill the creation one. You don't want to kill people's incentive to continue to make the pie bigger. But you probably want to stamp out this one, the extraction part of it. All right, so why do we even care? Okay. So I put this here to be a bit provocative. but also to get people to actually think about this question. Um, because most people just say, "Oh, it's terrible. It's just awful how we have all this rising income inequality." I mean, is it? I mean, is it like what specifically about it bothers you? Um, if you say it's obscene how much money is being made at the top. Um, why should that if it's a if again if it's a pure value creation game, and you know why should it bother you that somebody has way more, as long as you're doing okay. Does it bother me that there are professors making 400 grand a year? No, I don't care. There's multiple professors making 400 grand a year, or more. Just who cares? I'm fine, but it doesn't bother me. Or another way to think about this, like, would it be okay with you if we quadrupled the wealth of Jeff Bezos, um, but we doubled everyone else's wealth? Okay, if we should be okay with that. That's making everyone better off. Um, and so, if you're not okay with that, then what really is driving it is some sort of resentment or some sort of sense that these gains are unfair, and maybe they are. Um, but my point is, there's not necessarily, if it were the case that everyone was doing great, if everyone's making $2 million, $3 million a year, what does it matter that someone's making 5 billion or something? If everyone if everyone's doing fine, like, that gap shouldn't matter that much. And so my point is, again, like, as what we maybe should care about is not necessarily the top, but the bottom. What is going on at the bottom? And that is a concern about poverty, not necessarily inequality. But much of the focus out there in the world is on inequality, not poverty. To me, that's a little, and again, I get a little personal in this lecture. I get a little bit of my personal opinion since it's the last lecture. To me, the focus should be on this, not necessarily on this. And so, also to think about, just historically, most of us are in the top 1% of income earners in history. So just by dint of being born or living in the United States in 2020, most of us historically are in the top 1% of human earners that have ever lived. So if you take a historical perspective, we are all the 1%. Um, Okay, so being a bit provocative, and just saying, like, why do we care about this? Again, I think most of the concerns are driven by resentment. That may be unfair characterization, but that's my view of it. Um, and the proper concern should be focused on poverty. But there are some reasons why we should just be concerned about inequality in general. One, I think, is this: is if it comes from extraction, if those gains have come from increasing political entrepreneurship or crony capitalism of some kind. If there's some, if that's what's going on, if that's what's driving these sort of differences at the top. Here are other reasons why we might care about this. So this may be bad for social cohesion. Just in general, like, if we perceive that there is this gap in experience or gap in not necessarily outcomes, but opportunities, this will be bad for just general society, that we feel like we are living totally separate lives, or there is some world that is kind of that we can't access. Secondly, if you have obscene levels of wealth or income, it makes regulatory and political capture easier. So if you think, once somebody starts making, whatever, I don't know, $100 million a year, it makes it easier for them to enshrine that advantage. Okay, so they basically are able to get, you basically turn. Maybe they start with this value creation, but once they get all the money, then they're able to essentially capture the government and kind of enshrine that wealth. Okay. All right. So just thinking about the sources of income inequality, we are primarily going to focus on labor income, and we'll talk about why that is. So labor income is what you receive from working, your wages, your salary. We're not necessarily going to focus on capital income, which is, returns on, owning land, stocks, bonds, etc. And we'll talk about that in a second. Okay. So I just want to kind of clarify, me being provocative. Don't want to get in too much trouble. I think inequality is an issue. But again, I would just focus on this aspect of it. Focus on the bottom and focus on extraction and really think critically about what exactly about the inequality is concerning. Again, going back to the example, there are people in my profession making, 5, 6 times what I do. Okay. It is not, that is not a concern to me. One, because I don't live in poverty. And two, because most of the reason they make more is because their value creation. They're incredibly good at what they do. So that doesn't necessarily bother me. So the aspects of inequality, this is me personal, last lecture, so I'm being a little bit more, throwing my personal opinion a little more into it. This is what we should care about, this extraction part, if it comes from value extraction. And then, of course, this part. All right, we will get into the data in a second.